You ever get so upset about the corrupt church and the corrupt government that you can't see straight, want to spit, see red, all that kind of stuff? Well, good morning. Let's talk about it. We're not the first. So I'm going to tell you a story about the background of Psalm 50. And it all started when I read through the Psalm. As you know, I stay in the Psalms for a week at a clip, meditating my way through them. Oh, and good morning. This is Aunt Beth. Welcome to my lamppost. So I was in Psalm 50 and I saw it was written by a guy by the name of Asaph. Like, who is Asaph? Well, so he was a musician. He wasn't necessarily a leader. He played the cymbals. And he was there for both bringing the Ark of the Covenant back to the tabernacle, but then also when Solomon built the temple. So let's talk about this. I'm going to tell you a bunch of stories. And I want you to note in your brain the parallels between then and today. But my aha moment today, this morning, was that the Ark of the Covenant, which is where the Word of God was and the power of God was, didn't always reside in the tabernacle where they had the church services, the altar and the worship, and that's where people brought their money. And it all started with some very bad and corrupt priests who were also the judges, so to speak. This is prior to them having their first king in Israel in the Old Testament. And the story starts in 1 Samuel 4 and it progresses through. But and isn't God good? He provides an answer before you even know to call. So Eli is a very fat old man who didn't discipline his two sons, and he was the high priest and knew that his sons were committing sexual abuse and taking advantage of the people. And they were also skimming off the top as far as the sacrifices. He knew all this. In the middle of this, he's asked to raise Samuel, who is a boy that's an answer to prayer by his mother. It was a big deal whether you could have kids in those days. And even though her husband loved her best, because he had two wives, she didn't have any kids, so she prayed and asked God for a son to remove her shame. God gave her Samuel. Now, the cool thing is, she kept her promise and gave him to the service of the Lord, which must have been hard, really hard. But God ended up, after she gave Samuel away, blessed her with more children. And Samuel was an amazing prophet. It says that not one of his words fell to the ground. That meant that everything he spoke came to pass. But his mom gives him to this corrupt priesthood to raise. I mean, she didn't know. So they're battling the Philistines. Our current word for Philistine is Palestine, but they're battling the Philistines on and off. And the two corrupt sons underneath the high priest that had been doing all this sexual abuse and skimming off the top and everything, they said, well, let's take the Ark, the covenant, as sort of a magic symbol, you know, rabbit's foot, whatever, and we'll win the battles. So the Ark gets separated from the tabernacle where all the worship and everything is going on. And the Ark is carried into battle. It's the first time, and I think it's the only time that ever happened. And the Israelis lose. The Philistines get the Ark, and they start having plagues, and their idols start toppling over because they bring the Ark into their temple. You come in the morning, all the idols are flipped down, you know. These aren't little tiny things. These are big things on their face and broken before the Lord. So they're after 7 or 8 months, they get a clue and they send it back. Well, I'm not really sure that it's God, but they put it on a cart with cows that had just given birth and don't really want to leave. So they figure if the cows really leave, then it must be God. And they put the cart in the back along with all these gold offerings, you know, representations of all the plagues and tumors. And these aren't small things. It's a lot of gold. It's like boulders, you know, of representation. So it takes a 7-month journey and eventually comes back. But my point is, in all of this, the ark, the presence and power and the Word of God is separated from the religious system. So all during this time, they're still all offering prayers, they're still skimming off the top, they're still doing all this. But it's an empty suit. There's nothing there. So the ark goes and it's outside. It's when some of the Israeli farmers see it coming, they are so grateful and they tell the priest, but they peek inside and the power of God, zip, and I think it's 50,000 people are dead. Like, don't mess with God. He can defend himself. And so then it's in a location for like 20 years, and then it's moved to another location. And then David, okay, so in the meantime, Samuel, this pure child that grows up to be a prophet, the people say, oh, we want a king, we want to be like everybody else. So they anoint Saul, I think placeholder, okay, and he's everything that, I mean, he's picture perfect. He's the tallest person in the land. He's evidently handsome, But starting a year to 2 years in, everybody realizes this is a really bad mistake because Saul tries to be a priest and take power for himself. That's only 2 years in, and okay. So after this, and after Saul trying to take over the priesthood and offer sacrifices and do everything because he's king, God goes after Samuel and says, okay, we both know this was the wrong thing to do, but shake it off. Quit grieving. Go anoint David. So David is king number 2, and he's the one, he was anointed to be king, but he wasn't king yet. And it was during this time that he kills Goliath, the giant, and goes back And then he is king for 7 years of Judah. Judah and Israel have split. And it's after he's king of Judah that he conquers Jerusalem. See, the ark was in a town called Shiloh, which was about 20 miles north of Jerusalem. And he is the one that brings the ark to Jerusalem. Now there's a tabernacle and the ark. Okay. And then he wants to build a fancy place because he says, I'm living in a nice house and God's living in a tent. And the prophet Samuel's dead by this time. The prophet, I think it's Nathan, comes to him and said, at first he said, do whatever. And, and then the Lord talked to Nathan and said, no, he's got too much blood on his hands. Tell him to, have his son that's going to rule after him do it. So David draws up the plans and he saves all the money and the gold and the silver, and he makes all the arrangements, gets all the supplies. All Solomon has to do is put it together. And Solomon doesn't put the temple together. Well, he finishes it he starts it 4 years into his reign, and it takes 7 years. So 11 years into his reign, after his dad dies. They have the temple where the altar is and the sacrifices, and the ark is brought into the temple. And Asaph, the guy who wrote this psalm, has seen it all. And he was first mentioned after they brought the Ark of the Covenant from where it had been in the country closer to Jerusalem. And he was there when Solomon dedicated the temple. So he's known about the corrupt judges, the corrupt politicians, all the power games. He's seen the difference between the religious system and the altar and the whole thing. And, this is where you go to pray and this is where you go to give your money. But the power and the presence and the word are out in the country. And finally, they come together. There's a huge worship service. And Asaph writes a song. And he actually quotes the Lord, God, which is pretty amazing as a worshiper in those days. He was not even one of the priests that would offer the sacrifices. Okay. But listen, to what he quotes God as saying. He first talks to the pure-hearted believer, then he talks to the corrupt believer, and then he talks to the pure-hearted believer. This is not to Gentiles. These is all to believers. And in our day, this would be all to believers, pure-hearted and corrupt, and maybe you might say some corrupt politicians and judges. Okay, so we start at verse 14 and 15. That's to the pure-hearted. So my point is, you're living in the middle of empty suits and corruption. Do not be discouraged. Here's what God says. And these are all in quote marks, by the way. Asaph is quoting what he heard the Lord say. And elsewhere in the Old Testament, it calls him a seer. He wrote 12 Psalms. Okay, start with verse 14. Offer to God thanksgiving and pay your vows to the Most High. Call upon me in the day of trouble. I will deliver you, and you shall glorify me. Okay, pure-hearted. Then, but to the wicked, God says. Now, these are the wicked believers. This isn't people that don't know God or claim to know God. These are the people that have been in the system and skimming off the top and abusing their privileges and their people. But to the wicked, God says, what right have you to declare my statutes or take my covenant in your mouth? Seeing you hate instruction and cast my words behind you. When you saw a thief, you consented with him and have been a partaker with adulterers. You give your mouth to evil and your tongue frames deceit. You sit and speak against your brother, you slander your own mother's son. These things you have done, and I kept silent, and you thought that I was altogether like you. But I'll rebuke you and set them to order before your eyes. Now consider this, you who forget God, lest I tear you in pieces and there be none to deliver. Whoever offers praise glorifies me, and to him who orders his conduct aright, I will show the salvation of God. So that means clean up your act. So I want to encourage you, if you are a pure-hearted believer that's distressed about this separation from the religious system and that's just skimming off the top and abusing their people, but it's empty because the power and presence and word of God is out in the country somewhere. They're not in the same place. Be encouraged. This is not the first time that this has happened to us. I hope it's the last. But we need to be like Asaph. Worship God. God will deliver us. That doesn't mean we agree with the corruption that we see. Not at all. It's kind of sad that, history repeats. I know some fancy people say, well, it doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, but whatever. So, I hope this encourages you when you read Psalm 50. There's a whole lot going on below the surface. God sees, God hears, God is coming as a judge. He has said, call upon me and I'll deliver you. Not the power system. Call upon me. So, as always, I'll put the whole text of this psalm where you click the word more. And I hope this encourages you. Have a fabulous day.